You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Haley Rubinson, Vice President of Business Development at Revel. We talk about why mopeds work for urban mobility, the dominance of automobiles in discussions about transportation, and if land use plays a part in adoption trends. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting this podcast as well as Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We couldn't produce the show without your help. To join this merry band of dreamers and support the show, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. For $2 a month, we'll send you stickers and a handwritten note. For $10 a month, we'll send you one of our famous bus-only scarves. We just got in a new shipment, so we're ready for the new year. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of the Overhead Wire, sharing information on cities around the world with our readers and subscribers. Join us and try our one-of-a-kind daily newsletter for 2 weeks free. No credit cards, just an email address by visiting theoverheadwire.com. We've got 71,000 news links in our archive tagged by topic, so sign up and search away. And finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice. Go to raymondunwin.com to find out how you can download the book in your podcatcher and listen to each chapter like an episode of the show. We have a free Word document with timestamps on the site as well. Well, Haley Rubinson, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Great to be here.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. We appreciate it. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I am VP of Business Development at Revel. I was actually the first headquarter employee hired by the company when we were still in pilot mode, when we were operating 68 mopeds out of a storefront in Bushwick, Brooklyn. I oversee regulatory, public policy, and communications work. So basically that's working with cities to launch our fleets. We're not an ask for forgiveness type of company. We enter cities transparently and in lockstep with our regulators. It's also communicating with the communities we serve and the general public who we are and how we can add value to the cities we're in. Overall, it's really a dream job for me. Prior to Revel, I worked at a company called Tusk Ventures, where I consulted with startups with regulatory issues. But before that, my career was mostly in New York City and New York State government, working on transportation and infrastructure policy issues. But when I left Tusk, I said I wanted to find a super early stage transportation startup based in New York with co-founders that get the following things. First, when you run an urban transit network, whether government or private company, you have responsibility to all road users, not just your customers. That is not something that every company seems to get. And the second is working with regulators is not a necessary evil, nor is the relationship inherently adversarial. It's symbiotic completely, particularly in transportation. Cities and companies are fundamentally seeking to provide access, so we all need each other. And so coincidentally, these two principles really were part of the founding ethos of Revel, even before I got there by our co-founders. And it's a good thing. It continues to be embedded in everything we do. So, typical government affairs, external affairs jobs out there, particularly at private companies, you have a tendency to be siloed until there's a problem, or it's about permit and PR. What the awesome thing about working at Revel for me and my team is that we get to work across the company to help grow our product, our operation, our technology. It's really very, very rewarding.
And when did you get interested in transportation?
My first step was I was working in the Bloomberg administration. I thought I was going to pursue a career in social services, but alas, I got a great job at the Department of Transportation. Under the Bloomberg administration, the mayor really put a lot of importance in livability, movability, public space. And so I joined DOT in their intergovernmental affairs. There's a lot of city council legislation. So basically, it's negotiating legislation, writing legislation, fighting legislation from the city council. But the great thing was that it exposed me to every aspect of the agency at a time where the DOT was doing super, super innovative things. I came in, I sort of got the lay of the land. After my first about 6 months, Jeanette Sadakan came in, who I'm sure you're very familiar with, and took the reins. And so it was just a wonderful time to be in transportation. I mean, shutting Times Square down to traffic, like who would have ever thought? And to this day, it remains. And so it was just such an exciting time. It kind of reminds me of working at a startup now. and I will never go back. Another.
Wait. You'll never go back to the city?
No, I'm sorry. I would never go back to social services. It kind of pains me not to be working for the city, to be perfectly honest. I'll be back one day, I always say. But it was a great experience. And in addition to the huge things, even just on a daily basis, you're talking about things that are going to happen in the public realm. And then you see them in the public realm pretty quickly, which for government, it's very uncommon. Whereas in social services, it can be like climbing up a mountain. There's a lot of other issues, outside your control. So transportation became incredibly rewarding for me and I know city government doesn't sound thrilling to most people, but my time was absolutely thrilling. So
I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast might disagree with that.
Yeah, no, I know. I guess I'm talking to the right people.
Exactly. There's certain aspects of it, I'm sure, that are tough, but for the most part, I think people really like the public service of it. Were you always into transportation? Even when you were a kid, was that something that you were interested in or just something you fell into?
It's actually funny. I grew up in Brooklyn, and for many years of my childhood, did not realize how difficult it is to move around basically everywhere else. So I won't say that, I was a transportation wonk out of the womb, but I have a driver's license that my parents made me get. I never really wanted one. Between subways, buses, bikes, and car services, even pre-Uber and Lyft, there's always a way to get around. And it was actually when I went to college that I realized how difficult it was. And even though I have a driver's license, that is not my preference. I've never had any intention of owning a car. And it was crazy for me that most people actually felt the opposite way. So my interest in transportation started probably then in college, but really when I worked at DOT, it was a phenomenal experience. I consider myself a government person first. I believe in government. I love government. Local government's the best. Transportation, potentially, I guess, depending on the administration, is just probably the most exciting place to be in my mind in local government.
And so now you're at Revel. How did Revel get started? What was the impetus for bringing Mopeds to the city?
So our co-founders, Frank Rieg and Paul Suey, were working together as colleagues kind of in the energy research space. Paul actually came from oil. He is a chemical engineer. And Frank went on vacation to Buenos Aires, I believe, and saw all of these mopeds. And it was sort of at the time where shared fleets were coming to cities, not New York, but other cities, and thought, why not in New York? Him and Paul started talking about it, and they were like, yeah, why not in New York? And so they are two very incredible co-founders, very passionate, can really do anything. And they just sort of put their heads together and very, very quickly, I would say within, I think it was 6 months, put together the funding to launch the pilot. They brought, I think, 5 people on board that handle customer service, operations, everything. Proof of concept was there. And then less than 6 months after that, raised some more money, hired me, and we set off to plan on expanding in New York and then to our other markets.
And why mopeds? I mean, you just explained how he got the idea, but why mopeds? It's a different conveyance than maybe we've seen, everywhere else.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with his travels. Mopeds are old, man. It's old technology. It's lightweight, it's small, it's low profile. It's something that works in cities where there's never anywhere to park. You can park in between spaces, and it's really nothing new. It's just sort of not been the culture in United States cities. So that was part of it. Why not? The other piece of this is battery technology. So shortly before Revel was launched, there was just a tremendous improvement in electric vehicle battery technology. We use swappable batteries. So if the company had started a year prior to when it did, there would be some clunky batteries that had to be plugged into a wall that would get maybe 20, 25 miles of range. Technology had advanced so rapidly that we are now able to get 3 times that in range, and we can swap the batteries in and out with our full-time employees, and it is not clunky, and it's pretty seamless. And so in truth, the timing was really perfect for that reason, to actually operate a system like that in an efficient way.
Yeah, I think the first thing that came to my mind was Audrey Hepburn when I thought about mopeds, and Gregory Peck and Roman Holiday. What's your pop culture, connection to mopeds? Like, what do you think of when you see, besides now you're obviously at a company where you see them all the time, but what was your first kind of reaction pop culture wise to mopeds?
It's so funny you should say this because my life is so Revel that I cannot even think of the life before. To be perfectly honest, I think of sort of like the Italian countryside,
Yeah.
but actually, having grown up in Brooklyn, I know some people that have grown up in suburbs where maybe you can get a license earlier to ride a moped, have more experience. I really had like no experience whatsoever with mopeds at all. And so I think because of Revel, obviously, but also during COVID, I've noticed more of these two-wheel vehicles. They're probably closer to Vespa style mopeds than ours, but it's funny for me to think about a world before where I didn't think about it much at all, to be honest.
Another interesting thing about mopeds is that they're kind of in this space between automobiles and micromobility. So stand-up scooters and shared bikes, all those types of transportation modes. I'm wondering, from a regulatory standpoint, do you feel like you're getting the best of both worlds, or do you feel like you get the worst of both worlds?
I'll say the best of both worlds. I think, we're not a first, last mile exclusively. There's definitely a value in that. So I think we fit into the space nicely. But in the cities that we are in, if you're really going to leave your car at home, right, or you're really going to opt, for more sustainable mode, maybe not buy a car at all, kind of need the full range option. And that is where you probably not want to take a kick scooter 4 miles. So I think we fit nicely. If you're talking about in more of a regulatory perspective, we're also very clearly defined in city and state statutes. We're also very easy to enforce against because we have license plates. So they're actually, in our conversations with law enforcement in all of the cities that we operate, it's actually a lot easier for them to deal with a fleet of mopeds that park and ride in the streets just like cars do. There's a level of accountability. It's also highly regulated. We have to get license plates, registrations, insurance for every single one of our vehicles. In addition to that, everyone who rides our vehicles is covered by insurance. So that is a fundamental difference between us and then, your kick scooter or e-bike company. The ride itself is covered by insurance. And so I think it works more seamlessly in transportation networks as they exist today with existing infrastructure, the way what people are used to today, than these other modes. Not to say we shouldn't be building out our cities to accommodate other modes, but I do think they have been fitting a little more seamlessly in the cities that we're in.
If there was one thing you would change, though, what would it be from that standpoint of the regulations, or even from like infrastructure or things that you want, say, like the city of New York to do to make it more hospitable for mopeds?
I have to say the city's pretty hospitable to mopeds. I think it's interesting actually working with the city, having come, it was about 10 years ago when I worked at New York City DOT, when if you took away a parking space for, a bike kiosk, it was just like bloody murder. And it's really not like that anymore. I think there's a lot more, a broader acceptance for modes, and it's just sort of conventional. It's not a fringe movement or anything like that. In respect to mopeds, because we don't require special infrastructure, I would say what I would like to see is, ways to make the city more hospitable to other modes that are not 4,000 plus pound gas guzzling motor vehicles, trucks, and start replacing them with these lower footprint type vehicles of all types. But as it stands, I would say the regulatory framework, the regulatory structure here, the streetscape is hospitable. It works for our business model, even more so, I would say, than for other cities.
I feel like a lot of city officials have kind of a blind spot for cars. They let them get away with more, kind of look the other way when it comes to safety, collisions, things like that. I think we've seen that in New York and in other cities as well. They kind of give them a little bit more leeway. Do you feel like cars kind of get too much leeway when it comes to...
I do.
I just feel like I read a number of articles on Revel, and it felt like there was a lot of push to have them put you all in kind of a box with bikes, with cars, and the blame the victim mentality was very apparent in kind of some of the reading that I did.
I would agree. It's as a company that is providing a transportation service, like I said in the beginning, we have a responsibility. We are accountable to provide, a clean and efficient, safe service, which we do. But yeah, there's human nature, right? And so the one difference from what you're saying that I would say is that it's less about the regulators, and I would just say general public perception. We've all just accepted that you need cars, which I'm not even necessarily disagreeing with, but we've all accepted the dominance of the motor vehicle as we think of it. And that at this point, it is what it is, and we're just all going to accept it. And it's an inherent risk, and we do have Vision Zero, and we have a lot of stuff that regulators and advocates are doing to improve upon safety. But I think it's really the general public who may not be paying as much attention. These new modes seem scary, but were in truth people at places like the Department of Transportation and within advocacy organizations who are much more sensitive to what's happening on the streets on a daily basis in respect to traditional cars, trucks. They actually are sensitive to it. So that's not always the case. Our experience in New York City this summer, and we are grateful for it, it was the case. The DOT acknowledges for sure that we need to get to Vision Zero, and they're leading the way. And so I think concerns are obviously understandable. Coverage in the press, some of the other things that you read, I think, are a perception issue, but again, not taking accountability away from us as a company. But yeah, I think cars are the problem for sure, but we all have to do our part.
You all are competing with ride-hail, bikes, and transit for some of those shorter trips, and cars too, to a certain extent, because people like to drive their cars 2 feet. That's an exaggeration, obviously. But is there a limit to the market that's available for the mopeds in cities? Because I noticed you all pulled out of Austin because the market was limited because of the way that the land use is in that city.
Yeah, so mopeds are nothing new, but shared moped service in the US is. And so we've learned a ton. Our experience in Austin really showed us car culture is real. If you own a car, potentially like more cars than there are people in a household, if there are parking spots, it's a lot harder to get people out of their cars and onto more sustainable modes. It's not insurmountable, I don't think. To be fair, with COVID, it was sort of hard to figure that out. So there was a challenge, but I wouldn't give up on Austin yet, and I wouldn't give up on other cities either. I would just say it's hard to sort of experiment and to figure out what is needed to get people out of their cars right now. And so for Austin, right now just was not the time to figure it out. But I do fall short of saying it's impossible and it will never happen. But it's hard enough, to change sort of car culture attitudes in major cities, like even New York and San Francisco, where, you have far lower rates of car ownership. That's even difficult. Austin and cities like that are somewhat tougher, but I am optimistic. One of the bright spots after COVID could potentially be getting people out of their cars, but we'll figure that out after.
Yeah, COVID's been a really weird cat in that perspective. I noticed that some of the Austin discussion, there's no South by Southwest, there's no major festivals,
Right.
There's no conventions or anything to bring people in, which is a lot of Austin is that. So especially in the downtown area. So that's kind of an interesting wrinkle on some of these services and, COVID generally overall. What's the target audience for you all? Like, who are the riders? What are the types of folks that would ride a moped instead of maybe taking their bike or walking or taking the bus?
So I would say our target is everybody who has a driver's license and is 21 years of age and over and is a responsible rider. But really, like, everybody should be commuting via moped. Obviously, we want only people who are comfortable doing so. We offer lessons to get people comfortable, and they're very well attended. So we want everybody to ride. And although it's a fun activity, especially in COVID where there's not that much else to do, or, where it's difficult to get from neighborhood to neighborhood by other modes, certainly, but even just commuting, it's a really efficient way. I think people are really drawn to services like Uber and Lyft because, you get picked up and dropped off right where you need to go. The beauty of Revel, because of the low footprint parking is you can kind of do the same thing. So our target is everyone, but like anything else, there are certain people that are earlier to adopt and to try new things. In New York, which is our biggest market, aside from City Bike, we don't have other modes. So I think there has been a lot of interest actually through demographics, just because it's a new option that didn't exist. But, on the flip side, people have to get used to it. So we're really aiming to get everybody on a moped. And I think we're getting there. And I think we're also seeing, particularly in the past year, signups are really through the roof. People are interested. It may not be for you, but people want to try it. And so I think when the weather gets better, and ideally we're closer to the vaccine allowing us to do more things outside of our homes, we're going to see a lot of diversity in our ridership, a lot more than we even had before. But I have to say, when we expanded in New York over the summer, every borough, every neighborhood sort of has its own different culture, and, it works well everywhere. Using New York City as just an example, we went to the Bronx this summer and ridership was phenomenal. There's so much interest again, because it's just so starved of transit options. So I think there's no shortage of people who will be interested. I think we're only going to see more use cases, more types of people jumping on mopeds once we're all out of our homes.
So this summer you had a few folks pass away after riding the mopeds, getting collisions. Mm-hmm. And around July last year, you suspended a few thousand people from the program. What kinds of violations get people kicked out, and what kind of safety measures are being put in place now after those high-profile incidents?
Sure. Reckless riding, 100%. And we all know what that is. It could be a range of things: running lights, traveling in parks, things like that, the obvious things. And then, helmet usage was a problem, not shying away from that at all. It was not a problem prior to COVID, and then it was a problem, and it was pretty apparent, and it had to be addressed. Our process with helmet compliance is a warning, a brief suspension, and then being removed from our platform. So people have that option. It also is the law. Whereas something like reckless riding with a minor, which is actually illegal in New York City, but it is not allowed on our platform, those sorts of things will get you removed immediately from the platform permanently. Whereas things you may not be aware of, so entering a park legitimately by accident, not traveling so far into the park, will be a warning and a review, of our rules. This summer also, when we resumed service at the end of August, we introduced a safety training, which it's sort of an exam format, but it's actually intended to be a learning experience. So there's a series of questions. You have to answer them correctly twice. And it is a refresher on all of our rules. And so there's more of an acknowledgement of what the rules of the road are, although it is, incumbent on riders to understand the rules of the road. But we are seeing a much higher rate of compliance for sure. I mean, anybody who lives in New York right now can tell you that at the end of August, you were seeing almost everyone wearing helmets. There's always going to be, one or two people, whereas in July, you were seeing a lot of people traveling without helmets, and that's on Revel mopeds, but individually on mopeds as well. To improve helmet compliance, we also introduced a helmet selfie. And so when we got back on the road at the end of August, you take the training, and then before every ride, you have to put your helmet on, fasten it, take a picture. The thing gets processed. And if you are not wearing a helmet, if you take a picture of the floor or a cat, or you're just not wearing a helmet, you will be warned. The second time you'll be suspended. And, with any new technology, there's glitches. So maybe certain people were not understanding, but everything has been clarified. And, we suspend almost nobody anymore for not passing this helmet selfie.
Can you have a cat on your helmet?
That's on you. As long as that helmet's fastened. I mean, because I don't want to support anything like that.
I don't think you are. I'm asking a silly question. Is there a question that people ask you the most about the mopeds? Like if you get into a conversation with a friend and they find out that you work for Revel, what's the first thing they ask about?
What is the first thing? How do you charge them? Which is interesting. less in New York, but in other markets where there are kick scooters and you sort of have random people getting paid $5 to come, with a van and pick a bunch of them up. Our model with the swappable battery, we have our full-time employees swapping them in and out, doing light maintenance checks, but depending on ridership, in the summer when ridership is so high, mopeds get touched every day, right? So they're not sort of like lying around for long periods of time. They're kept in good condition. The batteries are swapped in and out. Right now with the winter where it's cold and ridership's down a little bit, we still have our field techs out at the vehicle swapping them, I would say a couple times a week. And again, doing those light maintenance checks. So I think it's how are they charged and generally how are they maintained is a question I do get a lot.
Have you done any research on the reduction in CO2 emissions from the electric vehicle that you're using to allow people to travel around?
Revel has. I do not have that answer for you, but I can get it to you. But yes, this is something that we are looking at.
Yeah, I'm interested just because, with the new administration, I think that climate's going to be put on the front burner, hopefully continuing on through many administrations going forward. But it's just interesting to see this kind of shift towards a discussion about electric vehicles. And if you already have electric vehicles, especially making those short trips, what does that mean in terms of the reduction? And this is something that comes up on the podcast a fair amount of times is that, we also have the issue of pollution and any vehicle is going to have some sort of pollution, whether that's rubber tire, detritus, or brake dust. Those things are not going away just because the vehicle is electric. But it's interesting to learn kind of what companies are thinking about when it comes to greenhouse gas reductions.
Yeah. So I'm probably the bad example because we are as a company thinking about this. But for me personally, from the beginning of being at Revel, I think the most impactful thing about our service is local air quality. And particularly, when we entered the Bronx that have very high rates of, childhood asthma and things like that, just air quality in neighborhoods in the moment that we started our pilot in Williamsburg and Bushwick, Brooklyn, and there is just like a ton of truck traffic running through. Obviously, we're not preventing the truck traffic specifically, but it really highlighted for me the value in EVs when it comes to local air quality. And so that's something that, like, in addition to obviously the carbon emission piece of this, I think is super important and why all of these forms of micromobility that are not gas powered are desirable for direct health reasons, especially in lower income communities that suffer disproportionately.
In Vietnam, they've actually tried to curtail mopeds and scooters because there's so many of them in the city. And I'm wondering if we'll ever get to a point in cities in the United States that is the case.
I think we will. Yeah, I think there seems to me that there has to be a sort of balance back in cities. There's just like an influx of all of these modes. I am, to be honest, always surprised when a new company with the same product offering, pops up in a city. But they are. But I think it will level out and demand and supply will start to make sense. That will happen on its own, if not as directed by the cities themselves.
What's success for you all? Like, what does that mean specifically?
Our tagline is we move people. So success is giving the people in the cities and communities we serve a viable transportation option for people who want it. So success is not every person with a driver's license who is 21 or over riding a moped, but it's that everybody has access to that. It's providing greater access. So, docked bike services, to wait 11 years to come to the Bronx. A huge success for us internally was expanding our service from Brooklyn and Queens to the Bronx, that is typically the last served within like a couple of years of our first launch, right, of 68 mopeds. And that success, I think, having a presence in cities that allow people to either make the choice not to purchase their own personal use vehicle, or people who cannot afford to purchase a vehicle hold insurance to provide a mode of access for those people. And so you're talking in relationship to safety, but the whole car culture question, right? A lot of it is, who can afford to get into traffic accidents? Like, who's allowed to drive? And I think with shared fleets that are actually viable modes of transportation for that full mile trip, allowing more people to have access to that, it just can't be a bad thing, right? And I don't think only people who can afford or choose to own a personal vehicle deserve to travel in one any less than anybody else. And so success for us is just providing access, particularly to people who do not have access. But, generally speaking, it's just another viable transportation option in cities.
That brings up important equity considerations. Are there neighborhoods in the city that are targets for you all that maybe didn't get service at the start that maybe should get service because they have lower incomes, or they're, certain communities of color that typically are underserved by new technologies and new transportation access modes?
Absolutely. So the way Revel makes sense is for there to be a contiguous service area. So you can actually ride the moped outside the service area. You can pause it and use it, but it has to be parked in the Revel zone. And that's for operational reasons. We need to keep them operational. We can't have mopeds sitting around, where the battery's discharged. So we sort of have to expand out from where we are. An exception to that is this past year, we did expand in Brooklyn and Queens, but we decided to focus on the Bronx specifically. So the Bronx and Manhattan are sort of its own network. It is legal to cross some of the East River Bridge crossings, but people speed on those crossings. We really don't want our riders with other vehicles. It's legal, but it's not the most comfortable feeling. So there's sort of like two networks. And so in order to get to communities most in need of these options, we're very happy to do that in the Bronx. In Brooklyn and Queens, we've continued to expand out. We'd like to serve everywhere. There's a variation of demand, of course, but we do serve a number of lower income communities now, and we do plan to expand out from there to serve more communities quickly. Our general principle is a Revel needs to be in a reasonable walking distance if you're really going to come to rely on it. You don't want to be 20 blocks away from the nearest Revel, because that's not really a viable option for you. So we aim for our fleet sizes to be, like a 2-3 block walk max. It's a little bit longer in New York because people walk more in New York, but even in our other markets, it's actually slightly smaller because they're not walking cities necessarily. The slow and steady approach for expansion for us is important. We want a quality service that people can rely on and can use. And so as opposed to just sort of peppering in a huge area, we want to serve an area we can serve well and then grow out from there, which is what we're doing.
So what's next for you all?
What is next? A lot. So we are continuing on building out our fleets in the cities that we're in, continuing to find more use cases and partnerships. We are talking to other cities. Again, our model is to be in lockstep with the cities. We do not surprise cities. We don't show up one day. We work with cities to launch. And we're thinking about other product lines. More on that to come. But generally speaking, our commitment to serve the cities that we're in, to provide like viable, clean transportation options, to create the foundation that people can actually live in cities and not rely 100% on a personal owned vehicle, that's sort of driving us. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that, and more to come on that a little bit later this year.
And you all are offering free rides to vaccination centers as well?
Yes. So any of your listeners who work at a vaccination center in any of our service areas are eligible for free rides. We just announced this yesterday. I think within a few hours, had hundreds of people signed up, which is awesome. And last year, we did this for all healthcare workers when we were in the height of quarantine and cities were really in lockdown, and anybody kind of moving around were essential, right? They really needed to get somewhere. For healthcare workers, we offered a free ride program. It's also why we expanded our service at that time to serve more hospital centers. It was successful, so we're doing this now again for workers at vaccine sites.
Finally, another thing that I was kind of impressed with reading some of your CEO, Frank's comments about specifically gig workers and Prop 22 here in California. I've made it pretty clear on the podcast that I was not a fan of Prop 22. And he's clearly said that it's not really fair and that all of Revel's employees are W-2 employees. I was impressed that he came out and made that stand, because I feel like there's a lot of discussion about, the gig economy, especially here in California, especially here in San Francisco. And I just wanted to acknowledge that fact.
Absolutely. We don't do gig. The company, in addition to, working with cities and communities, another founding principle was no gig economy. We don't need it. First, it's good for business. And that's really the truth. Obviously, workers that are exploited, it's just a bad thing, right? But I think it's important that companies start to actually look at the bigger picture, which is that, full-time employees with access to benefits, that's good for everybody. Our employees are why our fleet runs well, it's well maintained, it's good for business, right? And it's also good as a company to have coworkers, right? And not expendable resources. And so, you can devote money to sort of fighting that principle, or you can, provide full-time jobs with benefits to people. And that's what we've chosen to do. And we're not a charity, we're a company. It's good for us. I'll only speak for myself, but I'm not so bought into why it's so great for other companies, because our experience is really the opposite. We don't do gig, we never will, regardless of how we grow. And we do feel very strongly about that.
Haley, where can folks find information about Revel or more about you online?
They can go to gorevel.com and @gorevel on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, Haley, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old daily cities news list, by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.